What is up, fellow thermonuclear AFers? I am Dan Favale coming at you with another 2023-2024 NBA look ahead. Not preview, not outlook, not whatever. Fancy schmancy look aheads. We are joined by Matt Moderno, host of the Believe in Wizards podcast. And he is also does stuff at Bullets Forever. We're going to talk about, if you didn't catch it yet, and he's been on the show a few times already, the Washington Wizards. But first, remember to follow Matt on Twitter. I'm still going to call it Twitter, at Matt Moderno. That's at MATTMODDERNO. Great follow on Twitter. Does great work covering the Wizards. And if you're not following him already, remedy that. Matt, how the hell are you doing?
I'm great, Dan. I think for anybody who heard us do this last year, this will be a totally different vibe, I think. At least I'm going to try to keep it that way. So, yeah, I'm excited to actually talk about the Wizards, which, despite doing it all the time, is not always the case.
I do not remember you saying that last year. So I feel like we've already made progress.
Agreed. It's been cathartic, at least.
So I think we did like a home and home, basically, earlier this year after the Tommy Shepard dismissal, I believe. So we don't really need to get into that. And then throwing out the actual execution of this roster turn, teardown, whatever. Were you surprised that they actually did it? Were you relieved that they actually went this direction? What are your just thoughts and feelings on it? And as well as just like the fan base's general, inklings towards what's happening in Washington right now?
I think calling it a dream come true would not be an exaggeration. Like, I actually feel that way because I really didn't expect it. You have an owner that like banged his fist on the table and said, we will never, ever tank. And then they let him they let the new front office tear down like right away, essentially. And I just really didn't expect that. I thought we would see this kind of like forced, soft retooling kind of thing. But this is as close to tearing it down to the studs as you can get. Like, obviously, we'll talk about Kuzma being back, but that doesn't really change much for you and your long-term outlook. Like this is a drastically different roster with a drastically, different ceiling and objective. And I think it's a more positive one because at least you're not sort of that like lower middle. And, that's where nobody wants to be in sports. And that's where they've, perpetually been. So I think no matter what, they're already just doing better. And that always surprises me as a Wizards fan.
It is, we're going from Ted Leonsis kind of, really complimenting himself and the Wizards for giving out a no trade clause last year to now they've just ripped it down to like the bare bones, basically. That's just like a really big organizational 180. And I'm almost fascinated by like what took Ted Leonsis to get to this point to okay it. Like, what I just don't like. How do you go from that? Is it just because Bradley Beal decided he didn't want to be there anymore, and so they were kind of forced in this? It's just from Ted Leonsis's perspective, because that's the constant here. Yeah, you bring in a new front office, they want to leave their mark. I'm sure any new front office would have wanted to have torn this down. But like, how do you go from that to this?
I'll be honest with you, I'm going to give a lot of credit to just like one single person, which isn't probably fair, but like David Aldridge is just sort of my avatar for this because it took like some amount of like negative media, national media, for him to like seem to recognize this. He said like, I heard fans, I heard, the way people were talking about the team. And if you're a billionaire, you probably have some kind of an ego. You typically don't get that rich by not being, somewhat self-important and things like that. And when you've only been talked about nationally because you're a laughingstock, I think at some point you have to say like, all right, this isn't working. And that's been the change. Like the Wizards fan base I've always been kind of snarky, but I think the collective outrage at the end of last season was pretty extreme. And you have Bill Simmons going on his podcast and things like that, and just like openly laughing about where the Wizards are and talking about how they're not even worth talking about. It just, at some point that has to get to you, and you have to say like, okay, maybe we need to do something different. That's what I'm attributing it to, but I don't know, could have nothing to do with any of those things.
Shout out David Aldridge then. Yeah. I like that. I like taking that slant. So what did you make of the actual execution of it all? Because there are many steps involved here. And I think when you zoom out and kind of look at who and what they ended up with, a lot of people are going to be underwhelmed. And I personally, we did grades on this. I think that's the wrong way to look at it, but I'm just curious how you view the actual execution of this teardown at the moment so far.
Yeah, when you talked about it, I think I was like sort of on the same boat, right? It was just when you see like, oh, Bradley Beal got this return, it doesn't sound that great, or Kristaps Porzingis got this return. It doesn't sound that great, but just you can't really look at those things in a vacuum. You have to look at the context of the situation, their exact circumstances, their contract, just where they are as assets in the league right now. And I honestly think it was probably about the best they could have done. Like, you could maybe nitpick that maybe another second round pick or another pick swap or a top 25 protected first round pick in there would have been nice. Like, it doesn't really matter. I chose to get salty about Jordan Goodwin being thrown in the Bradley Beal trade because I really like Jordan Goodwin and we could use a good young guard. But at the end of the day, like, that's not a deal breaker, and it gets him off your books and you get to start fresh. And I think that's really what the most important thing that came out of that is, just like the clean slate. Like, you're not tied to these anchor contracts. Like, Tommy Shepard would have re-signed Kristaps Porzingis to a huge deal, and we'd be hearing about the plantar fasciitis, and like, it would have been an immediate thing where we'd be saddled with his contract. Whereas, like, Kuzma, keeping him of the three, he's probably the one that has the most immediate flippability if you want to go into that. So I think that's it's kind of inspired thinking, in my opinion. I think they've like hit it out of the park so far. And granted, the teardown is sometimes always easier than the build up. So we'll see where they go from here. But so far, so good, in my opinion.
I love flippability. I feel like I'm going to say that all the time now. It's a new verb that I'm going to want to use. Yeah, and I'm with you on it. And I think, to kind of compare it to a different situation, it's when people took issue with the other side of the Bradley Beal trade, whereas, man, how could the Suns do this and give up all their depth? The value they gave up for Bradley Beal in a vacuum, you do that 11 times out of 10. If your issue is the depth that they're left with or the assets they're left with, your issue is the original trade for Kevin Durant. It's not the Bradley Beal trade. And so in the Wizards circumstance, it's your issue is not what you got for Bradley Beal. It's that Bradley Beal had a no trade clause.
It's the contract.
Your issue is not what you got for Porzingis. It's that you traded him when he could have just become a free agent and left anyway. So what were you supposed to get for him? And also, but the Porzingis deal, this is probably an unpopular or minority take. I think they did the best out of that 3-team scenario. I didn't like it for Memphis or Boston all that much. So I can quibble over things. I know how you felt about Monte Morris. I was like, I felt like they sold a little low, and it's my callous perspective is, but I rather have the flexibility, or Jordan Poole is something I still sort of grapple over. But like, free agency's dead. We've seen it. And you're in Washington rebuilding at the moment anyway. So cap space is only going to get you more bad contracts. And so would have been nice if they would have gotten more than a fake first round pick, whatever. So I thought they did. You use the word inspired, and I think that's the right way to frame it. I also think it's the benefit of having fresh perspective in here, where Michael Winger, Will Dawkins are not attached or viewing these players, this organization, the same way that Tommy Shepard is, who's responsible for so many of these moves. And there's the two elements of, okay, well, your internal evaluation of these players might just be higher because you put them together. Then it's two, even if it's not, you kind of have to make it so it's higher because you need to win the press conference, and you're now undoing things that you've already done. And so I think that's the benefit in any case of sort of changing regimes.
At least, like, if you squint hard enough now, you can see like sort of the makings of a modern basketball team. Like, we won't be putting 2 drop coverage centers into the starting lineup. Granted, we could use probably another center on this roster, but like,
you go from playing 2 of them to like,
we've got a half of one
going to play.
Yeah, exactly. Like, we might need to bring Taj Gibson back if we had the roster spot to do it, which is wild. But yeah, like, it's at least looking toward where like the teams that you've seen Winger and Dawkins and Schlenk like want to build. I think Schlenk is the one that gets mentioned the least, but that Hawks team, like, it obviously didn't work out with him as well as they probably would have liked, but he tried to build a modern basketball team, and building around Trae Young is like, maybe you could argue with whether that's the guy to do that around, but the pieces around that, they drafted the right blueprint of guys. Not all of them worked out, but I think you're starting to see like the makings of that team around, where this Washington like group is already starting to go. So I'm cool with that. At least we're going to be in the year 2023 and not the year 2003. And that's even a big step forward.
I think my favorite thing they might have done this offseason was just trading up one spot to get Bilal Coulibaly, because it felt like such a Sam Presti thing. And then Sam Presti basically did the same thing, but I think leasing out way too much of cap space to move up 2 spots. What are your first general impressions of Bilal Coulibaly so far?
I don't even actually care if he works out. I mean, I care if he works out, but like just the pick is such a big change over the last several draft picks. And the first thing Tommy Shepard said when he got, promoted to that job was, we're going to draft like athletic, switchable wings that can shoot. And then they didn't. I mean, if you want to call Ruby a wing and say he's like pretty athletic and switchable, who could shoot, didn't really shoot it that well at the time. Like Deni doesn't really shoot it. He's brought here to be an offensive player, doesn't really provide much on that end. So they've gotten kind of lucky that he's been as good defensively as he has. I wouldn't say Johnny Davis is an athletic wing who could shoot. Like it just, they didn't do what they said. And now whether Coulibaly ultimately ends up being able to shoot it or not, at the end of the day, like that's what a modern wing looks like. He's long, he's athletic, he's got a ton of upside. The form looks good on the jump shot. Like you can see a world where Coulibaly does like a Trey Murphy impression in 2 years, like that kind of thing. Or Mikal Bridges, like that mold of player that everybody in the league seems to value. They finally went after that kind of guy. And I'm sure Jarris Walker will end up being a great player. I'm sure Taylor Hendricks will end up being a really good player. But those would have been like the Tommy Shepard kind of picks, I feel like, of just like limited, like the cap for them is probably like the fourth best player on a good team. If Coulibaly pops, I mean, I think the ceiling is higher than that. It's riskier, but I'm okay with a bigger swing, especially when you're jumpstarting a rebuild, because you've got to hit on those kinds of guys. And if you're trying to hit singles, like that's a common Wizards fan exception or expression is they always try to hit singles. Like at least you went for the triple here, and it could screw you in the long run, but I at least like the effort and the attempt. And he's just, it was interesting to watch him kind of develop quickly on the fly last year for Metropolitan's 92. Like he went from not playing at all, not even being on the big club, being brought up and not playing, slowly in the rotation. Then he's the fifth starter, just kind of a switchable wing. And by the end of the year, he's like running pick and roll with Victor Wembanyama in the French League Championship. Like that learning curve is incredible, and it's going to be a huge jump up into the NBA. But you've already seen him kind of like learn and evolve on the fly, and like that's the kind of player that's exciting as a fan. So at the very least, if he just brings some excitement, we'll take that around here.
And I'm with you that you swing in that spot. I should say you swing in the spot that you're in right now, which is sort of just starting from this blank slate, even though that's not what necessarily your roster suggests. And there's no other player that really would have fit that bill. Like maybe Cam Whitmore, but the medicals must have been, I would assume, abysmal on him since he slid so far. And I will say, just based off like his defensive package in Summer League,
that's great.
I'm sold. And then there's just, I mean, like he hit a couple of escape dribble jumpers, and it's like, okay, like I'm sold. I'm like, this is the pick. Like I'm excited to see what he can do. And I am curious though, in that regard, what do you kind of expect his year one, role to be? Is he going to be given a lot of runway, or just kind of given, I guess there's not a glut there, but just all these other maybe on-ball options on offense? Is he going to get lost a little bit in the shuffle there? Like, what do you expect his year one role to be?
I think that really comes down to like where the front office is at with Wes Unseld Jr. these days. Like he was kind of like forced upon them to some extent. It feels like Ted Leonsis said, like Wes will be back before they even hired this whole front office. So I don't know how in sync they're going to be. And I think we're going to see that a lot early. I think he'd been really reluctant to play some of these younger guys and let them play through mistakes. Now, given maybe that was the mandate of the team, like we're trying to win now, like, okay, fine. So I think we'll see a lot about like what his mindset is, because there were times last year where like Daniel Gafford would like make a mistake and he'd be benched for Taj Gibson, the ghost of Taj Gibson, for like 3 quarters. And you'd be like, hey, isn't Gafford still on this team? So if Coulibaly comes out and just gets like beat backdoor on the first play, is he going to sit for the next half? So I think that'll be really kind of the interesting thing here, is if he just like lets him stretch his legs a little bit. And Coulibaly, I think, can come in day one and be like an energy defender, a transition weapon. And that's like probably it. I don't think you'll see him doing like the ball handling he was doing in Summer League right away. But could you see that by the end of the season? I think if last year's trajectory or progression is any indicator, like he's probably somebody that will like scale up as the season goes on. And I'm okay with that. Like there's some Wizards fans that want to start him day one. I wouldn't do that to him personally. Like let's just let him build slowly. And there was a reason nobody talked about him in the top 10 of this draft. It's everybody thought he'd be a 2024 guy. Like he made a huge leap really quickly. Like let's not throw too much at him at once. That's at least how I would approach it.
Yeah, and it's also if you're coming off the bench, in theory, like he then should. I know there's a lot of like guards on this team, but
Sure.
you should have more of an opportunity to do things on offense then. And so there's
Yeah.
value in not starting right away in that regard too. You brought this up. Is Wes Unseld Jr. like sort of coaching for his job here? And looking at the context of this roster and where it's headed, what does coaching for your job even actually look like?
I think like I don't know the man. Like I've hosted podcasts with players that have played for him and stuff, and they all speak highly about Wes, like the person and the relationship builder. But last year's team seemed to struggle with like motivation and buy-in and things like that. And you'd see some guys like kind of chirping at him, in the huddle and things like that. And not that that doesn't happen on other NBA teams, but when Scott Brooks was about to get fired, you heard multiple people like Westbrook and Beal especially go to bat for him. At the end of last season, I think a lot of the Wizards seemed to throw Wes under the bus to some extent. Like you had Monte Morris and Corey Kispert specifically talking about like, we need to play faster next year. And the coaching staff was reluctant to do that. Or, hey, finally they started to listen to us later in the season. Like Monte threw a little shade, which was surprising that Wes was kind of his guy. And I don't think he did it like disrespectfully or anything, but it was clear that like they weren't kind of bought in. And it'll be interesting to see like if that happens. And I think if you see this team like come out and play hard as shit, like from day one, and like guys are into it, maybe that's what coaching for your job looks like. It's just consistent buy-in, and that when they only have like 15 wins in March, like are they still playing hard and that kind of thing. If you can get that from Wes Unseld, and he can keep these guys like into it and engaged, I think that's a win and enough that they'll probably bring him back for another year. I would think if these guys are out and Poole and Kuzma are fighting over who gets more touches and things like that, I don't know if Wes Unseld is the guy that, kind of falls on the sword there a little bit, but you've got a staff right now that he's going to have to bring it. Like David Vanderpool will be an NBA head coach soon.
Mm-hmm.
He could be the next one here if Wes doesn't work out. Brian Keefe got interviewed for multiple head coach jobs, and he's the next guy down the bench. Whereas like last year's staff, when Wes had picked his own guys, there was no one that was really going to push him. Like they brought in people to be around him and support him, but they're also there as like break in case of emergency. Like if he's not getting the job done, bring in these player development guys that get people to buy in right away. And, maybe you see what you look like with them the last 20 games of the year, something like that.
I think his contract runs through 24, 25, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just like, I don't know, the timing of that. And it's always, it's not a red flag, but you always get the sense that there's going to be a change in the sidelines coming when you switch front office regimes.
Right.
Like I feel like it's very rare that when a front office inherits a coach that it works out for more than like a year and a half or something.
Yeah, I'm totally with you.
Deni Avdija, big season for my guy coming up. Is he going to be given, and I'll use the word again, the agency to really get to work on offense? And I think we saw a little bit of it after the Bradley Beal trade last year. But is he going to get that type of control, or is he in danger of sort of getting lost in the shuffle of, okay, well, we have Bilal Coulibaly here, we have Kyle Kuzma, we have Corey Kispert, we have a bunch of other guards in DeLon Wright and Jordan Poole and Tyus Jones who can handle the ball. Like, what does the immediate future hold for Deni Avdija on this team?
There was like an 8-game stretch last year, I want to say post trade deadline, where like we got to see Turbo Deni, and that like half the Wizards fan base like erupted about like, yes, finally we've seen the guy we wanted to see. And he looked confident, and he was just like kind of like balling out there, right? Like there was flow, and he just seemed to like really taken a step forward, and it just kind of fizzled out over the course of the year. And then when they shut Bradley Beal down and Porzingis finally sat a little bit, you started to see a little bit more of that again, of just like, here, have the ball, try to do good things. And I think that's what he would have most benefited from the last couple of years, is to be on this kind of team and be given the opportunity to just like feel his way out. Like Deni needs the ball to provide some value on offense, but he's not good enough with it that you're going to take the ball away from some of the other guys that they've had the last couple of years. On this team, like you probably want that. Like I don't think Poole wants to be a point guard. I don't think Kuzma wants to have to be a point guard. Not that they can't create some for themselves and others, but other than like Tyus Jones, like they probably need some other guys in this rotation that like can make other things happen. And I think Deni can do that. To me, This roster being kind of undersized is actually probably better for him. I think he's best as like a small ball 4, maybe even some small ball 5 from time
Hell
to time.
yeah.
Like
Let's see it.
he's a strong enough dude, but he's not like crazy quick. So he's not beating threes off the dribble a lot. He can't really dribble with his left hand still. But you could beat a slower 4 or 5. Like, could he take Isaiah Stewart off the dribble? Yeah, sure. Like something like that. So I'd like to see that more. It still comes down to the shooting. Like if he can't shoot it, you can't see enough of the other things he does well. If no one closes out on him, he can't attack a closeout, like, so you can't use the ball handling and the reasonable speed that he has. So I think that's still the swing skill. It's a swing skill for a lot of NBA guys, but for him to provide offensive value, he just has to shoot it at a reasonable enough clip that people can't guard him like he's Draymond or Russell Westbrook. And that happened at times last year. So if he's 35%, is that enough to like be respectable that he can, put the ball on the floor a little bit more? Sure. He started to finish around the rim a little bit better. That was great to see. That'd been like kind of the biggest problem I'd had with him offensively. The defense is really good. So
Yeah.
if you want him to be on the court, and like Tyus Jones he tries on defense, but he's not a great defender, just given the size and athleticism. Jordan Poole hasn't guarded anybody since middle school, probably. Like they need somebody else that's going to want to do that. Like Kispert will try, but he's not ever going to be a stopper. So some of these guys on the perimeter, like they have to bring a little bit of intensity. And I think you'll see Deni do that. Also think he guards bigs better than he does quick guards. So maybe if you're playing him more at the 4-5, you can actually best utilize him. And so I don't know. I think he'll be better this year. Will he shoot it well enough to unlock these things that I think this front office is going to want to invest in longer term is the question.
Yeah, and if people who are not Wizards fans listening to this podcast, I feel like, and everyone knows that I'm a Deni Avdija like fanatic, basically. And are you impressed that I waited like 4 questions?
It was
before I
nice.
got
Yeah,
to
you
him?
buried the lead here a little bit.
It was restraint, but he's a caps lock defender. Now you said he's not like great against quick guards, but like he can guard.
He can. No,
I
mean nobody guards Ja Morant that well, so that's kind of a nitpick.
It's more so just like if you had to. I'm not saying build the ideal defender for these guys, but like almost the ideal matchup for him is like you see him on James Harden or a Luka, where it's like those guys are really tough, but they're not operating at blazing fast speeds, and so that's where he can really shine. Yeah, I am. And shooting. When we mention shooting, it becomes a cliche. For him, it's really a big deal because like if there's not really the in between game, you're right. He was finishing around the rim better, and I think he knows how to like use his shoulders and be physical with the ball. I actually don't really have a problem with his ball handling, except he doesn't. You already mentioned that he's not going to be able to use his left hand. And then it feels like when he's going into traffic, like there aren't enough counters for him. And now I'm a little bit concerned where is he going to, you can still throw Mike Muscala on the floor. Danilo Gallinari's on this roster for anyone who cares. Is there going to be like enough spacing around him? Because losing Kristaps is like kind of a big loss there. And so like that would be my concern. I believe, but it's going to come down to the shooting. Is there anything else though, aside specifically from the shooting, that you're going to be watching when it comes to him?
I think you mentioned the spacing there, right? Like that's really interesting, and that's probably why he won't start. I would have said the only open competition for one of the starting positions, I'm sure we'll get this, is between him and Corey Kispert at the 3. And I think Kispert gets it just because it's so hard to have 2 non-shooters, and Gafford's not going to stretch the floor. So if you're already playing him, I think Kuzma, like whether he shoots a great percentage or not, teams guard him like he's a good shooter. I think the same thing is kind of true for Jordan Poole. Like the percentage may not always be as good as you want, and he can be a little streaky, but teams guard him like he can shoot. So can you put Gafford and Deni out there together for long stretches of a game and not have things clog up is really going to be the question. But yeah, you put him next to Kispert and some of these other guys. I think that'll help a little bit there. I mentioned the defense just on the guard thing. Like there were a lot of times last year where they had to put Kuzma on some of these like quicker guards. Like he would guard Trae Young when they played the Hawks, or he would guard Dame when they guarded Portland. I'd like to see Deni do that a little bit more. There's not a ton of other options. Like I don't know how much DeLon Wright plays on this roster, just given where they're trying to go. I hope he plays a decent amount, but he's probably their only other really good perimeter defender. So just seeing Deni be able to be that guy for them would unlock a lot. And then you can be switchable 1 through 4 at the very least, if you can do those kinds of things and have him take on those primary matchups with really anyone they need him to. I think that versatility would be the best probably.
Is there like any chance that he would sign an extension, or is it just sort of off the table just because the new front office is in here? And I'll even frame it this way: like, what would be the, and I've thrown this in the outline, like, what would be the, like, if you had to rank these in terms of most likely outcomes? There's sign an extension, get traded by the deadline, re-signs as a restricted free agent, or just leaves in free agency next year.
I think traded at the deadline is probably the most realistic, and I get classified as like a Deni hater. I actually think he's like not far from being like a really, really productive player, which is like why I want more for him. Like if he actually shoots it, he's the kind of guy that every roster in the NBA wants to have. So that's why the like I've changed my form for the 5th time since I've been here stuff is a little frustrating. Like just rep it out at some point. But I don't know. I can't imagine that like he's gonna be their kind of guy and they're gonna offer the kind of extension that is gonna make him and his team happy unless he struggles enough this year that I don't know. I just think there's always some team out there that's gonna take a chance on a 6'7", 6'8" guy that defends and is still young enough that if he figures the other stuff out, like he's still 22. If 3 years from now he's a shooter, that wouldn't shock me. So somebody will probably continue to take a bet on that. I think this next contract will probably be for a reasonable number. It's if this next contract doesn't go well, he might be a vet minimum kind of guy by then. Like he might be Derek Jones Jr. or somebody that's like a switchable wing and does nothing else for you offensively. So it's going to be tough. Like I think he probably either gets traded or walks. If I were them, like what kind of deal would make sense to me? Like a 3 for mid to low 30s is probably as like much as I'd be willing to do. I'm kind of terrible at the cap contract stuff, so I don't even know if that's like insanely low or insanely high or whatever. But I think it'll really depend on the team because I think there are some teams that are probably all the way out and some teams that are still like willing to take a shot.
Yeah, I mean, like that's mid-level money, which I
Yeah.
guess would seem fair. I'd be curious what he was thinking or what he would get on the open market. But if you could get him for like 3 and 14 per year, it's like 3 and 50, was that 50 or
Yeah.
42?
Yeah.
I think I would probably do it. I don't expect that the Wizards would do it. So I'm excited to grade whatever team gives Deni Avdija an offer sheet or trades for him at the deadline very, very highly when they do so. I'll look forward to that.
If you're him and like you have an okay year, maybe it's worth coming back here because you would get more opportunity here to prove it. I don't know. I guess maybe it depends on what your role is and if they trust you enough to do things and they see a fit for you longer term. Maybe you see a shorter prove it deal to come back is probably like the only situation where I could see that. But yeah, I don't know. I think he's probably not a Wizard next year if I had to guess.
What did you make of the Jordan Poole flyer?
I think that's the kind of guy you take a flyer on. Like I don't necessarily love Jordan Poole, the player, in a vacuum. I think he'll come in, he'll immediately score it from day one. Worst case scenario, he's the player we saw for large stretches last year, and that's probably not worth the money over the life of the contract, but he still becomes tradable probably on the back end of that. And he also, you have to have a certain amount of salary to hit the floor anyway. So that's okay. Like I'd rather it be for a guy like that that has some higher upside. If he can be even like close to the guy we saw when he played and Steph Curry didn't, now all of a sudden like that's an exciting player. If he can scale up and be even more of a facilitator, can he defend even a little bit? Like that all of a sudden becomes this intriguing guy that he either is your long-term piece that you've gotten on like for almost nothing essentially, or he's a flippable guy that you turn into other longer term pieces for you. So this is like a win-win-win for me. Like the worst case isn't that bad, and the best case, like I think, is pretty high upside.
Do you expect him to run a lot of point here? Or are they going to try and sort of dissuade him from that type of stuff?
The Wizards' offense in the final 5 minutes of games last year was hear Brad do things. So letting Jordan Poole be the guy to do that or fill that role maybe would surprise me. I don't know. Do you need Tyus Jones out there to run offense for you if they're both going to get hunted down the stretch of games? That becomes a little dicey to me. I think maybe you can get enough like playmaking from Kuzma and Poole out there that you don't need like a pure point guard kind of guy down the stretch of a game. And especially if like Deni's playing well enough that he can be in there as like kind of your third creator, that might be enough for you. And then like it's a little easier for me to envision Poole like guarding, the worst offensive player on the other team down the stretch than it is like now he's got to guard like somebody's decent offensive guard. So I don't think he'll like run the offense for large stretches just because there are so many other guards that they're going to have to give minutes to and figure out what to do with them. But to close games, it wouldn't surprise me.
I'm almost wondering if his like a partnership with Deni Avdija would be beneficial to him, because I feel like even when Steph was out, a lot of his best moments were with, hey, it came alongside Draymond Green, to where someone who had like the basketball IQ and like the passing, and Deni Avdija is not Draymond Green, clearly, but like, is that sort of a marriage that could help? Because I don't think Jordan Poole is your primary shot creator for both himself and others. I actually think is a pretty like big whiff. And I've disagreed with Warriors fans on that for years. And I think that he's always been at his best insulated in some level. And so I'm just curious how I'm curious what the best lineups that include Jordan Poole will end up looking like on this team.
A dribble handoff with Deni, I think is a really interesting thing that I hope we see a good amount of. Like, I don't know how it'll actually work, but like maybe Poole has the ability to scale up more as like a self creator. Like he has the handle and things like that to do it. Can he do it consistently enough? I don't know. So if you have a few of those guys that take some pressure off him, like, is there a big enough discrepancy in who guards Jordan Poole and Kyle Kuzma that you can run a pick and roll between those two guys? Like, if you're switching the same kind of defender, it doesn't really do you any good. But especially if they're playing small and a bigger guys on Kuzma, and you can run some pick and roll between those two guys now, I think that's really interesting. But it's just going to be. It's all on Jordan Poole, right? Like this is what does he do kind of like determines how the rest of the roster and the people around him really fit. Like there are certain guys I think he'll make sense playing with. Like I think Tyus Jones is really good for him offensively for the majority of these games because he'll go out of his way to try to spoon feed some easy baskets for some of these guys. Like as maybe more talented as some of the guys the Wizards lost were, from last season, like Kyle Kuzma never had anybody create like an easy shot for him on last year's roster. Like it was always him like breaking the play and trying to do something for himself. They didn't run plays for him. Tyus Jones, I think, is a guy that can like get a few easy baskets for Poole and Kuzma, and then in turn, maybe they can get it for others. So I'm actually excited about Jones on that front, at least.
Were you surprised that they ended up keeping Kyle Kuzma, and would you expect him to still be on the roster past the trade deadline? Because the contract is 4 for 90 on a declining scale. It's basically just like the cliff notes of it. That's seemed like a very fair deal. And it made me sort of wonder, like, I guess Kuzma didn't really have that strong of an open market. But where did you sort of land on him coming back, and how do you actually expect this to play out?
The way you feel about Deni is the way I feel about Kyle Kuzma. Like I'm an irrational Kyle Kuzma guy. So I think he might be like one of the most easily tradable people in the NBA this upcoming year. And almost any team that's trying to win something could convince themselves that this guy on a declining contract can come in and fit with almost any team. Like he's 6'4". He can play 1 through 4 at 6'10", depending on what you need, or guard 1 through 4 at the very least. That's huge. I think no matter who has somebody go down with an injury that's trying to win a championship, like he could come and plug some hole for you. So that's intriguing. And he probably wouldn't take like a ton to get back. Like I can't imagine the Wizards are expecting like a king's ransom for Kuzma if they ever decide to trade him. I do think they probably, just given the types of guys that these three front office guys have all seemed to prioritize, I do think he fits with the kind of mold of player that they look for, like this positional versatility and size and things like that, and playmaking for a big. So I don't think they're going to be in a hurry to trade him. I think if there is a situation where they can like get a ton for him, they're not going to be afraid to do it. He's probably not like a long-term piece for you. So why hold on to him longer than you needed to? That was one thing the front office previously was always afraid to do, is like, okay, we flipped Davis Bertans from, we traded him for Aaron White to the Spurs, and nobody knows who Aaron White was unless they're a Big Ten basketball fan. Like, and then they wouldn't trade him for 2 first-round picks and then re-sign him to a terrible deal. Like, I don't think these guys are going to be afraid to flip him at peak value. So if he comes out and he's like lighting the league on fire because he's got this insane usage or something, I think they would be willing to pull the trigger for any deal that makes sense, but also not be in a rush to do it. He's like the best leader and mentor on the team by all accounts. Like you always hear about he and Deni playing one-on-one after games and things like that. Like this is the guy that kind of took on that, like, I want to help everybody else on this team be better. And that seems something that honestly, like Beal and maybe to some extent Porzingis were reluctant to do. And I can't imagine that that's an inconsequential thing in the fact that he's the guy that's still here.
Yeah, I would say even if you set, I think the people would normally set the over-under of 0.5 seasons left in Washington based off this deal. I'd actually take the over.
I would too.
Because I just feel everything that you just sort of outlaid here, and there's a chance that contract only becomes more valuable as it goes on. I think in the final year, it's projected to be less than 12% of the cap. And so like that'll be his age. It was a 31 season that takes him through. So like that's just perfect timing. And I think that he at least seemed content in Washington with his role. And, you know, that would be my other question is, do you see his role changing from last season, if at all, with the makeup of this roster? But even if it moves, if it doesn't, there's like a level of prominence in Washington right now where if he got traded to a contender, he's probably not going to have it. So maybe he's okay being sort of not the old head, but the mentor here, and then maybe a go-to guy on a roster that's not that great. Maybe they hit lightning in a bottle with Bilal Coulibaly and their next pick, and they're just fun and they're a little bit better than expected. And so this is almost one of those contracts where it's not mandatory. Like you said, if an offer comes and you have to take it, you pull the trigger. But where I look at Tyus Jones expiring deal, DeLon Wright expiring deal, even Deni Avdija going into his contract year, like those all feel like guys, maybe even Daniel Gafford, like that could just be traded before Kyle Kuzma because of what he brings both on and off the court to this roster.
It seems like everybody that's been good for the Wizards the last couple of years was when they were good, there was always this ticking clock of like what the next contract looked like. And do you flip them now? Like there was always this immediate decision that had to be made. And I think the nice thing about what this front office is doing is like now with somebody like Kuzma or even with Poole, these are guys you have to decide on right away. And given where you are, you can just afford to see where you're at in 2 years. The other thing that you could do here is if you do want to flip this for like, let's say you're better quickly than you think, and Coulibaly by year 2 is like, you know, insane or something like that. Like Kuzma also becomes like a really intriguing piece to throw into a trade to help you hit a large portion of the salary you need to match with somebody too. So like that's intriguing. Like you mentioned, the cap probably goes up. I think from that perspective, his deal like is going to look really good to somebody 2 years down the line. So maybe you even get more for him in 2 years than you could get now. So why rush to do it? So I just don't think they have to hurry. And that kind of like flexibility is a luxury that the Wizards haven't had in a really long time. And I'm excited to see what these guys can actually do with it. They're not going to have to act desperate. Like the Wizards, all the contracts they've given out have been desperation moves for the most part. That their hands were forced into doing them. Now, probably the 2 most impactful players on the roster, you're not in any hurry to decide things with. I can't see Kuzma being the guy that like immediately rocks the boat. If they're only going to be a 24-win team, like I don't think he's going to be the dude who's like, I demand out of here. He got a ring already. I think he likes being in a reasonably decent market. He's close to New York. Like he can do the things he seems to like to do off the court reasonably well from Washington. I think he likes having national relevance. So being the first or second best player on the Wizards, is that better than being the 4th best player on the Bucks? Like, you know, I think this might fit where he wants to be, at least for the next year or 2.
Will his role, do you see it changing at all based on the current makeup of the roster?
I totally just ignored that part of the question. Sorry about that.
Oh, no. Don't apologize. That was like more of like throwing it aside. I'm just curious because of all the type of control he had over the offense out of really necessity a lot of the times last year. I'm just wondering if we sort of specifically on offense, like if we see his usage change at all.
They talked a lot about how most of their offense was geared toward running things through Beal or Porzingis, and they didn't actually ever run plays, like straight up plays to feature Kyle Kuzma. I think you'll see more of that this year. I think maybe he gets easier looks next to somebody like a Tyus Jones. That'll be interesting. Could you even see a situation where like he and Daniel Gafford run some pick and roll? Like, I don't know if that makes any sense. Like, I think they'll experiment a little bit more with him. I think you'll see him in these different lineups. And that was kind of the thing he brought to this team the last couple of years, was just that positional versatility that like a lot of these guys, they couldn't go up or down. Like Monte Morris is a 1. Before that, you know, like every other small point guard that had Ish and Raul Neto and all these other guys, like they were locked into one position. Although we did somehow play Neto at small forward in the playoffs one year, which is another amazing fact. But like there are other people now that are switchable with him, and I think that's interesting. So you could do a lot of really intriguing things. At the end of the day, he's going to be pretty high usage. He's probably going to be fairly ball dominant, I would imagine, but he's a willing passer and things like that. So maybe you see him wanting to get some of these younger guys more involved and then picking his spots a little bit better on offense. So I don't know, like 110% version of the guy we saw last year would probably be my guess.
Of players we have not mentioned yet, Corey Kisper's floating around, or at least haven't gone into detail on Corey Kisper's floating around out there. Your guy, Johnny Davis, your favorite. Who intrigues you the most long term on this roster?
This is
and it's a tough question, right? Because that's why I asked it. It was just like getting it because they're in such the infancy of their rebuild, and they're not working from a point where they had a lot of players that you bill as, oh, we have to retain them. That once you we went through Bilal Coulibaly and Deni Avdija, it's like, oh, well, like this question gets super tough.
It's both super tough in like a negative way because there's like no immediate standout, but also not in the worst way because there's like a few guys that kind of could be potentially. I think Kispert's one of those guys where like he's just young enough and just good enough that you could see him being here longer term and you could help fit him into the makeup of your team and where you want to go with it. But he's also old enough and productive enough that like a veteran team trying to win something now might be intrigued by a guy like him to come in and, you know, provide some spacing. And I don't know, I think he's more than just a shooter, at least offensively. He tries defensively. I don't think he's particularly good, but he's not like a total like turnstile. So that's a win. So I think any team in the league could be intrigued by somebody like Corey Kispert, the Wizards included. So it's nice from that perspective of you could go either way with him. I think Johnny Davis, I really think there's a world where like he's like a really serviceable rotation wing defender. And
so we know what position Donnie Davis is now. I know that was up for debate last year where the front office didn't even seem to know who he was, quite frankly, but definitely what he was.
Yeah, the GM and the coach and the player themselves weren't on the same page about what he was and what he can do and what he can be. So we saw him be kind of more of a focal point offensively on the Summer League team. That's really our first look at him with any of these other guys. He wasn't particularly efficient in Summer League, but he was a lot more aggressive and confident. I think you would probably throw him in there to be like a less athletic Gary Payton II kind of guy. Like can he guard other people's best perimeter players or something like that? I really have liked the defense from John Davis day one. Can he shoot it well enough? He's already not like his knees aren't touching when he shoots now. So that's probably a step in the right direction for building a longer term shot. There's just like a lot of guys like that that could make some sense. Could Ryan Rollins turn into something? Could Patrick Baldwin Jr. turn into something?
Warriors fans believe the answer to the latter is hell yes.
No. Oh, hell yes. Oh, okay. They were in on PBJ.
Yeah. I didn't see it personally. Like I didn't see it, but they were the way you felt about different type of player, but the way you felt about Jordan Goodwin is how I feel like Warriors fans reacted to PBJ being thrown into the Chris Paul trade.
See, like I never really got it with him personally. I never watched him play in high school where that's apparently where all this stuff popped and playmaking. And, you know, my co-host Jahadi White has sons that are in the AAU circuit. And he said when they'd see Patrick Baldwin Jr. on that, like he looked like Lamar Odom with a jump shot. And he was like doing all this creating and playmaking and things like that. So maybe if you can unlock some of those things in this situation, like that's great. It's another kind of guy. It's the right kind of guy to take a flyer on, whether I see it or not. And you gave up the 57th pick to do it. That seems worthwhile to me. I don't know if he were any good, would someone like the Warriors give up on him for the second to last pick in the draft? Probably not. That would be a bad sign in my opinion, but I don't know. I'm rambling, but like there's a few guys here that could be intriguing enough that you want to see if they could be anything for you longer term, at least.
I forgot the PBJ trade was separate from the Chris Paul. The Washington did too much stuff this offseason. They still sort of
I don't know if it got like lumped in there after the fact, but it was essentially him for Trace Jackson Davis is how it worked out. And
I have in my notes saying Trace Jackson Davis for cash. I'm assuming that's just a mistake though, because now that you're mentioning it, I was like, I think that might have been separate, but he's not. I got the team right. That's all I meant.
Yeah.
He's on the
No,
Wizards.
yeah, you're good.
As we're recording this leads into sort of a nice segue with it. They have 16 players under contract. Do you have any, would you guess or have any preferences on, okay, well, who are they going to get rid of from here? Do you look at Xavier Cook? Do you look at Ryan Rollins, Patrick Baldwin Jr., Anthony Gill as players that you actually want on the roster moving forward? Like just sort of that jumble towards the bottom. Do you expect that they could go the route of, well, it doesn't seem like Danilo Gallinari wants a buyout. He just doesn't want to be a minimum guy. Like, do they go that route ultimately? Just what are sort of your thoughts or feelings there?
I think we've seen enough to know at this point that Anthony Gill is probably never anything more than like the last guy or two on the bench of an NBA team. They're probably projecting him to be like their third center this year, which is insane to me personally. I
Would you say insulting? Is that what you said?
No, I'm just not a big fan of him and his ability to provide any real value for them as like an unathletic 6'8" small ball center who doesn't actually shoot. If he were like, I don't know, they got intrigued by him shooting 40% on 2 3-pointers a game overseas when they brought him over, and he was going to be their next Davis Bertans as this like 6'8" stretch 4. And I don't have it in front of me, but if I had to guess, he was well below 30% from 3 last year. So if you don't shoot it, you're not like a great defender. He's not particularly athletic. He's just like a guy, essentially. To me, there's a world where at least Baldwin Jr. or Ryan Rollins are more than just the last man on the bench. So I would absolutely get rid of Gill before I get rid of them. They all love Gill in the locker room and what a great dude he is and how he tries to help the young guys. That's valuable. But you've got Muscala, you've got Gallinari. Like how many, you got DeLon Wright, like how many of these older veteran mentor leader guys do we really need? And Gill can't help you on the court. I don't really know what Cooks does for you, despite him playing really well in FIBA. I know everybody's like convinced themselves that means he'll like magically be an impact player for the Wizards, but how many guys play well for their country and then don't do shit in the NBA? So that's kind of what I expect from Cooks. I'd love to be proven wrong, but he's another guy. I think he's 27 already. Like, is there some world where he morphs into a drastically better player? I doubt it. So if you're going to fill the bench out with these kind of iffy contributors, I'd rather than be young iffy contributors.
I guess I don't mind the idea of having an Anthony Gill as a small ball 5 just based off like the physicality that's packed into his sort of, miniature package. But you're right, like not having the athleticism and not being a proven shooter definitely hurts. If you're playing the 5, I'm wondering if it doesn't hurt as much. But that's not the way to evaluate. Oh, it's like he's not as damaging as I thought he was. Is maybe
exactly.
not the best
Like
way to evaluate.
I think we could do better. There's probably some young guy in the G League right now that I'd rather give that last third big spot to. I'd rather take Michael Foster Jr. or Jonte Porter or one of these kind of guys that are like 23 years old and big and potentially have some skills than someone like Gill, where we've kind of seen what he is, and there's just not a lot of ceiling left there.
Is there, for me anyway, when I look at this roster, I struggle to see, not in a bad way, but just the identifying principles of how they will play. Yeah. Is there anything stylistically that you want to see them do or that you're looking forward to seeing them do with the current core that is in place?
If they're not one of the 5 fastest teams in terms of pace in the league this year, like I'll be actively pissed because I think that's kind of the one thread I'm starting to see here a little bit. Like Gafford is probably a bottom 5 starting center in the NBA, but he runs the floor pretty hard and he's athletic and he's not going to like beat you up in the post or anything like that. But could he beat some guys down the floor? That'd be interesting. Kuzma can grab and go and has been a pretty good defensive rebounder for the Wizards. Deni can grab and go. Like Corey can put the ball on the floor a little bit. Jordan Poole, I think, can grab and go. Like that's kind of the throughput, I think, for this team. Coulibaly will be good in transition. I think that's where Xavier Cooks probably provides his most value if you play someone like that. So that's what I'd try to do personally, is just be really active and aggressive and switchable defensively as much as humanly possible and just run everything. And when you're a younger team and you've got fresh legs, like this is the team I think other teams wouldn't want to play in like December, like when they're all kind of banged up a little bit already, or,
right.
It's like the third game of a 4-game stretch over a couple of days. Like I don't know. I think you get to the doldrums of the NBA season and you're like, shit, I got to play these young dudes that are going to run on everything. Like, I'd like to see them be that kind of team. When they made Wes Unseld Jr. the head coach, the first thing he said was like, we're going to slow it down because you can't play fast and play defense, which is crazy to think that anybody thinks in 2023, but that's fine. But that's what I would do with this team. And I think that's maybe what this personnel is suited for. Like, you've got a lot of guys in the same kind of like height range. So if you put a lineup out there where like Jordan Poole is your smallest guy and Daniel Gafford is your biggest guy, there's a lot of like cool things you can do to switch that. And I would just be as annoying to play as you could possibly be with this particular group.
Yeah, they were not a fast team last year. They were just, when you look at all like the metrics of like, their average possession time after a made shot, after a turn, they were, even after a turnover, they're like, let's just slow it down. Yeah. Just kind of, and that's just, I think with this roster, you're right. You should definitely play that way. I'm also wondering, this has also not really been like a hallmark under Wes Unseld. Is like, can they be ultra aggressive on the defensive end?
That's what I would love to see.
They were 29th in opponent turnover rate last year. And I'm just looking at Bilal Coulibaly. You have Daniel Gafford there. DeLon Wright is like, he's a good player. I can't believe what they get him from Atlanta. He signed from Atlanta.
For literally nothing. Yeah, he was a steal, I think.
I didn't understand. I know they got DeJounte Murray that summer, but I didn't understand. That's a good player.
Yep.
Like, you have Deni Avdija. Like, I don't expect this to be a good defensive team, but it feels like they have enough maybe like chaos creators on even Kyle Kuzma.
100% agree. Yeah.
So I would love to see them, like, I don't care if you foul too much. Not if your defense ends up being bad, who cares? Like, let's just juice up
the next guy. Yeah.
The transition offense that way.
That just want to stay with that for 1 second, Dan, because I think one of like my generation of Wizards fans' favorite teams was that first couple year Gilbert Arenas, Larry Hughes Wizards team, and they weren't good defensively, but Eddie Jordan just told them like, gamble on everything and steal everything you can. And, Larry led the league in steals and Gill was third in the league in steals that year, I think. So like, they weren't good defensively, but they created opportunities for themselves just by being, like you said, insanely aggressive. And I think that's like, maybe like Jordan Poole is never going to like lock in on somebody defensively, but he might get excited about playing some defense if he gets to shoot the gap every time and try to get a run out. So that's the kind of stuff I would be trying to position them to do.
You're now a veteran of this podcast, so you're ready for the cookie cutter portion.
I love it.
Of the look ahead. What is the 10-man rotation look like for this team? And I think it's probably even beginning with the starting five. Normally, I feel like a lot of teams have it etched in stone, but you even kind of mentioned it feels like there's 4 locks there for sure. But so beginning with the starting five, what's the 10-man rotation look like for this team?
If I were a betting man, I think the guaranteed starting five is probably Tyus Jones, Jordan Poole, Corey Kispert, Kyle Kuzma, Daniel Gafford. The only one I think that maybe is potentially up for debate there is the Deni Corey one. And that's maybe just to like try to make the lineup fit a certain way based on what they want to do. But it's probably Corey at this point. But then Deni comes off the bench. I think you got to get DeLon Wright in there somehow. It would be a disservice to not play Coulibaly at least some going into the year. We haven't talked about Mike Muscala really at all, but
Henry Shamit's on this team too.
Yeah. I think what this like, the 10-man rotation looks like to start the year is probably really different than what it looks like by the middle of the season. Do you play Shamet some now and see if you can flip him for something? Do you have to feature Gallinari now some to see if you can flip him for anything? Does DeLon Wright play more now to see if you can turn him into something? Like, there are a lot of those kinds of guys that it'd be nice to get something for. I don't know if you can do it, but I would at least try. And I think that makes predicting the 10-man rotation like really tough. Like Johnny Davis, you can afford to wait on a little bit here. So maybe if he doesn't play till the back half of the year a little bit more, that's fine. But at some point you have to see him in NBA minutes and see if he can give you anything. So like, he probably needs to be in the rotation. If you're going to keep Xavier Cooks, does he have to get some minutes? And because you're so small, he or Gill probably have to play. Or is Gallinari your third big? Like, I don't know how this works. So it's just, there's so many of those kind of question mark guys of like peripheral people. I personally don't give a shit about Landry Shamet. I don't think you're going to turn him into a lot if you trade him. It's maybe you get a 2nd round pick for him and he doesn't really help you much in the long term because he's basically an expiring deal because the money's not guaranteed, I think, beyond this year. So to me, he's a guy I wouldn't put in the rotation at the expense of seeing if Johnny Davis can give you anything. So like those are kind of the ones like that's what I would do, but I don't know if they'll do it.
So it feels like there are 8 locks. The starting lineup you outlaid plus Deni, Bilal Coulibaly, and DeLon Wright would be like the sort of locked out. Their playoff rotation
is
will be
probably
those.
locked too. Like
I was going to say their lack of bigs probably needs to make it Muscala unless they're really invested in Xavier Cooks maybe playing that spot a little bit.
Yeah.
So this is to some extent matchup dependent and how much of the Wizards are going to be trying to win close games. But what's their best crunch time unit to you? Is it just their starting 5, or would you futz and fiddle with it a little bit?
I think that's one of the situations where you could maybe shuffle between Deni and Corey given the situation. And I don't know, like if you've got playmaking on the court with Poole and Kuzma and a Deni, do you need Tyus out there to close games too? Like, should that be where you put a DeLon Wright in? Like he's, I think, a better catch and shoot guy than we've seen. He's not going to create a ton of offense for you, but he'll lock somebody down and help you as a team defender. So he's not going to get hunted at the very least. So I think it'll really depend on, just kind of what the other teams do. Like, I think the nice thing about this roster is they can be somewhat reactive. It's not like here's our group and this is the only thing we can roll with or we're screwed. It's a little bit like the kind of football analogy where like if you have 2 quarterbacks, you don't have any quarterbacks. That's kind of how I feel about this team to some extent. Where like you could play any of these guys, but it's probably not a good thing that you don't have like a bunch of no-brainers to fill out the rest of the rotation here.
Is there a quirky, weirdo, unconventional lineup you want to see this team try?
I would like to see some combination of DeLon, Poole, Kispert, Deni, Kuzma, and just going small and switching everything. That would be interesting to me, I think. Or maybe you go Poole, Kispert, Deni, Kuzma, Muscala, and try to play fast and spread the floor a lot. And again, if you're just going to run on people, like, do you really need a pure point guard in those situations the way NBA basketball is played right now anyway? So I would just try to have as many switchable guys on the court as you can and whoever allows you to play the fastest. And especially to close these games, like just make everybody be guardable. There are so many situations last year where the Wizards would have 2 guys out there that teams didn't have to guard. And it's like, I wonder why Bradley Beal can't dribble through 3 people without turning the ball over. So I would try to avoid those things, but we'll see.
The lineup I have, and I still don't have the 5th spot finalized. I want to make it like defensive anarchy, basically. And so give me Bilal Coulibaly, give me Deni Avdija, give me DeLon Wright. And I have Xavier Cooks in there just as like, I don't really know what to do with the 5. Like, I think he's probably the best if you're going to look at trying to switch right now. And then you could throw, like, do you want Tyus Jones for his game management? Do you want Jordan Poole for his offensive chaos? I might even just settle on Kyle Kuzma and say, like, we're just not going to go with any. We'll just have Kuzma and Deni Avdija and Bilal Coulibaly run some stuff. I just want to see what that lineup would look like at both ends of the floor. I don't know if they'd be particularly good, but I feel like they'd be entertaining.
It'd be fun. And again, like I said, I've been kind of the Kuzma truther, but the defensive metrics are kind of sketchy on him. Like some favor him, some don't. It really kind of depends on what you look at. But I listen to a lot of these post-game press conferences when other teams come in and play the Wizards. And there were a lot of times last year where like really good NBA players, like star NBA players singled out like, man, it is tough as shit to shoot over Kyle Kuzma. Like I remember Dame specifically saying that after a game of just like, that is just a long dude who can keep his feet in front of you. So whether like he gets graded out as a great defender or not, I think, he still makes life tough enough for you that if you're going to do this like chaos defensive lineup, he's somebody I would want out there because again, at least you could switch him through a lot of different guys.
All right, book it. We'll go Cooks, Kuzma, Avdija, Wright, and Bilal Coulibaly. I don't think that all. I feel like they're probably better on defense than offense, right? Right.
Yeah, it seems like a reasonably safe bet at this point.
The Wizards over-under, as we currently record this, is set at 24.5.
Yeah.
Are you taking the over-under on that? And where do you see them? I can't even frame it this way. Are they the worst team in the Eastern Conference?
I would hammer the over. Like, I really would. I don't think by a lot, but if this team won 28 games, it wouldn't really shock me. Like, are they drastically worse than last year's team that won 35 games? Like, yes, they're less talented, but like the give a shit level might be a lot higher with this year's group. And there's a world where it's like just total chaos and Jordan Poole doesn't get along with anybody and someone wants to punch him by the 3rd day of training camp, or Kuzma wants out of town right away, or some of these older veteran guys are cooked, and Coulibaly is 3 years away. Like, it could be bad. I just think there's enough here where, like, I kind of have like that weird good feeling, and I'm like the eternal like pessimist with this team. So this is not a me thing. Like, I do typically take the over, but barely, and I don't expect them to do anything in the playoffs. Like, this year, there's no way there's a playoff team, but I think the league is like really scrunched together a lot more now, and you're going to see a lot less 60 win teams, but a lot less below 20 win teams. So 26, 20, something like that. Like, I would take the over, but by a very little. And I don't know if they'll be the worst team in the East. Like, there could be somebody else that where they get banged up. If Cade Cunningham's suddenly not better for Detroit this year, like, could they be just as bad if they have an injury or two? Like, could somebody decide to blow it up midway through the year? Does Atlanta get like cagey and decide like this isn't going to work? Let's tear it all down. Like, I'm saying Atlanta is going to do that, but you know what I mean? Like, to me, they're better than Charlotte. I have no love for that Charlotte roster whatsoever. Like, that's like the island of misfit toys to me. I don't think they are going to have good vibes and good chemistry and things like that. You need LaMelo to stay healthy. That's been a little tougher to do. Is Terry Rozier going to be there long term? Maybe his contract is shitty enough that he is. I don't know that Miles Bridges is enough of a needle mover to me that really helps. So I don't want to turn that into your Hornets preview, but they're worse to me. But I could be a biased homer.
I guess the 24, it's so low.
It's so
there
low.
are 3 teams that won fewer than 25 games last year. So it's so low. And I get that. I'm also just based off what they've already done. If they're like winning at a pace that's better than bottom of the East,
yeah,
I'm like, oh, like Tyus Jones gone, DeLon Wright gone.
They'll strip it for parts. Yeah.
Right. And so that would be like, I don't know where I would settle on that just yet. Sure. We haven't done the over under pod. Yeah, but I'm struggling to identify which teams I would say they could definitely be better than in the East. I think I'm very high on Detroit, but if they're married to playing the wrong front court lineups, they're very combustible. Yeah. Charlotte's interesting because I don't believe in them, but they're very well coached. They won 27 last year with LaMelo being injured. And is Brandon Miller good? Does Miles Bridges help you? Sure. So it's just, I guess my belief is that Michael Winger wants this to be the worst team in the East, and so they will be the worst team in the East. Is just where I sort of land on that.
I really hope that that's the case, and I think I'm a little bit scarred by like the "will never tank" under Ted Leonsis thing. Even though last year they finally shut it down, they just waited too late to do it. I hope this front office is empowered to be like, okay, it's February and we're actually like competitive. Everyone over 27 has to go, but. That's what I would like to see happen. I don't know that they'll actually do it. I do think that they'll be empowered enough to shut it down at some point to keep them from like being better. If that even is possible, I could just be being crazy here and wouldn't be the first time. But yeah, I don't know. It just 24.5 is too low to me. If you said 26 was the number, I'd be like, oh, okay, that I can do. Like, they're as good as last year's Charlotte team, in my opinion. And then you said as a 27 win team, like, it wouldn't shock me if this Wizards team did that.
There's in the East specifically, the West is going to be, I think, more of a bear than the East. There's some teams that have the implosive potential too. Just Chicago. I don't know what the fuck's going on in Toronto. I don't even want to do their look ahead because they're confusing the shit out of me. It's like there are those sort of teams right there. And then there's just like, I don't even know what to do about the Nets, where it's like Mikal Bridges is a stud, but kind of lost in the shuffle of Mikal Bridges breaking out. Plus, they did play like I thought they defended Joel Embiid well for how small they were, but lost in that shuffle was, like they kind of sucked after they got rid of all their stars. Like they weren't a good team. So yeah, I could talk myself into this team hitting me over, and the number's so low that I might eventually pick it. I just kind of, if they're like better than 14th in the East, I'll be floored because I just don't think the front office is going to let it happen.
Bottom 3 is like guaranteed. Bottom 2, probably pretty darn likely. If someone was worse than them, it wouldn't shock me. That's all I'm saying.
And I think like to really just believe in the under, again, it could be under, like injuries happen, but you really have to believe that they're getting rid of guys or shutting them down. And they're not doing what like Utah did last season. I'm not saying they'd be as good out of the gate, but it's everyone I think picked the under with Utah because, okay, the roster was better than, I don't even remember what their over under was, but it was better than, let's say, the 27 wins or whatever they had it at. Sure. But you just believe that Danny Ainge was going to make those moves early, and he
Right.
didn't. He made them later.
Mm.
So to really believe in this under, you have to believe that Michael Winger, Will Dawkins are going to make the moves early. Like Kyle Kuzma is traded like way before the deadline, or even DeLon Wright and Tyus Jones didn't really talk about him. He's like kind of sneaky important if you want to run your half court offense. He doesn't turn the ball over. He's great at making those pocket passes. He showed some better shooting last year in Memphis, especially when Ja was out. It's like you really have to believe that these guys will not be playing by like January.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
to think that, oh yeah, they're not going to reach 25 for sure.
And why would you do that? Like their value a month into the season isn't going to be any different than it is right now. Even if they start out like a supernova, people are going to want to see Tyus Jones starting point guard for longer to believe he's worth trading for more than he would have gotten you just this offseason. So that's why I think they're there until
like that's just someone who doesn't infringe upon the development of anybody. If you're the Wizards, yours bird rights, I just want to keep him.
I agree. I wouldn't be in any hurry to do it. I also don't know that you can have him and Poole as your backcourt together long term and ever guard anybody. But
I am so low on Jordan Poole. I would keep Tyus Jones over him and just like I can't. I get it of what the aesthetics of Jordan Poole's game sometimes look amazing. He's an underrated finisher at the basket for the most part. I think he's gotten better as a passer. I just don't see it. I think he was so insulated in Golden State, but maybe I'll be wrong.
I don't even really care which one looks better longer term. I just think that even if they both look good longer term, that's probably just like not a good fitting backcourt.
No, you're right.
But for that reason, so you can make the decision either way. I think Jones is really intriguing. He could be a longer term guy, or he could be a short term sell high guy if you need to. That's another decent way for them to go about it with somebody like that. So yeah, he gives you some options, but yeah, to buy into the under of that number, you also have to believe that like the Jordan Poole we saw last year is Jordan Poole, if not even maybe like worse. If he's any better than that.
I do believe that.
Yeah, really? Okay.
I just think that I don't want to get caught because I picked the under for Utah. So I'm trying to be more cognizant this year.
Yeah.
And there's talent on this roster. It's not, they've torn it down, but like there's real, like, and if Gallo is healthy and plays, like that's a useful guy as well. So yeah, I don't have a feel for it. Even if you think, and I do believe Michael Winger will make sure they're bad. Sure. It's when do those moves happen? Because even if you want to move these guys, I think you get caught in the thinking of, well, like we might be able to get more around the deadline when more teams are willing to move around their players because certain teams are just ready to make moves before others are.
Yeah.
So I don't like, and I would be shocked if they made any sort of notable trade before January.
I don't think so either.
Matt, this was great as always. Is there anyone or anything about this team I didn't ask you that you think we need to discuss?
No, I mean, I think hopefully anybody listened to last year's pod versus this year notices that I'm somewhat more upbeat as a Wizards fan, which is kind of hard to do. But I guess, Dan, my question for you is like, do you feel better about their long-term future now versus the last time we talked?
Sorry, as I plug in my light going out at the buzzer of the podcast. Yeah, I think, look, there's value in making the decision. And I know that they're not left with a ton of these just A+ assets to go and turn around and trade for a star, or Bilal Coulibaly is not your typical, all right, well, they just had this really high draft pick. They were starting from a very restrictive baseline, beginning with that Bradley Beal no trade clause, the timing of moving Kristaps Porzingis. Like you might have been able to get more than Tyus Jones as a headliner if you moved Porzingis at the deadline. I mean, I'm not even sure that you would have, just given his, he was so healthy last year. Like that was just an anomaly.
That was always best case, yeah.
And there's nothing now encumbering you. And it's, you owe I know Knicks fans will be obsessed with where the Wizards are because that pick is protected through.
Probably never conveys at this point.
Yeah. But like, it's protected enough to where it's, well, we decide our destiny. And like, maybe they're good by 2026 and it's top 8 protected and it conveys. That's fine. I know a lot of fans like to point out, especially to people who cover the league, like the entire league, that there's more than just about winning a title. And I totally get that. Sure. The Wizards have been stuck in this submittal shithole for so long that to say, hey, we're going to take this step back deliberately and we're going to angle for something better than a first round exit, essentially. Yeah. Like, and it's just, I find that you use it at the top of this podcast. I find it inspiring as a fan to say, finally, even if it doesn't work out, like finally we're trying something different. And I think that matters.
Yeah. No, I think that perfectly sums up where the vast majority of us probably are with this team. It's just if best case scenario you were capped out with old guys and you could maybe make the play in, like that was the ceiling. That's just not an intriguing place to be. Whereas like if this team was on pace to make the play in halfway through the year, we would be ecstatic, and you might get more butts in seats if you're this ownership group. Like, so that's great. The only other guy we didn't mention, their second round pick, Tristan Vukcevic.
Is he coming over this year?
So he's probably not going to come over, and
Okay.
I think that's a mistake. To me,
Okay.
if I've got a 7-foot stretch big and I needed a big, I would want him to learn under Gallinari and Muscala and other. They're not all the same player, but like stretchier bigs. And he's going to play for Partizan, and that's like a loaded EuroLeague team that he barely played 14 minutes a game on last year and doesn't look primed for a ton of minutes on this year. Even if he just came over and played on the G League team all year, to me, that's better because at least you control that and he learns your system and he can be in the same practice gym as all your NBA guys. So that is one move I haven't liked that you can't clear. Like I would get rid of Landry Shamet now if it meant I could bring Vukcevic over.
I keep forgetting. Why is it Landry Shamet, the guy that I'm forgetting is on this roster? Him and Gallo like snuck up on me too. I was like, that's right, Gallo's here.
It's so random. It just doesn't seem to make any sense for them to be here very long. If anyone gets traded early, it should be one of those two guys.
Matt, this was great as always. Are you able to tell our listeners where they can find you and all the great work that you do?
Yeah, sure. If anybody is interested in more Wizards content or just sort of player perspective, I host my show, the Believe in Wizards podcast, with former Wizard Jahadi White. Jahadi's like a great dude and will answer any question anybody has about playing in the NBA. And I just ask him random shit, some weeks about just like, hey, what's it like to take an elbow from Shaq? Like things like that are always interesting to me as a fan. So we just had Chris Whitney, a former Wizard, on and talked a lot about playing high-low and playing out of the post and things like that more a little bit. So it just, if you want to hear just kind of a different perspective on how to play basketball in today's NBA, check us out. It's BLEAV in Wizards. We're part of the Believe Podcast Network. And then over at Bullets Forever, check us out. And yeah, see the Twitter handle if you're watching this online, at Matt Moderno. I'm happy to engage with anybody about anything. So just hit me up.
He will. I'll speak whenever. I went on your podcast once, and the engagement that you get on your tweets, and you respond to pretty much everybody. So the links to all that stuff will be in our podcast and YouTube description as well. So go subscribe to Believe in Wizards. Follow Matt. Thank you so much. As you know by now, I will be pestering you again in the future.
Ditto. I plan on doing another home and home if you'll come back.
Absolutely.